The key felt too heavy for something that small. It was a plain brass house key, warm from Claire Whitmore's hand and damp from the rain that had started falling as soon as the last shovel of dirt hit her husband's grave. I remember looking down at it in my palm, then back at her black dress, the mud on the hem, the little streak of mascara she had missed under one eye. Behind us, the funeral home doors were still open. People were inside eating finger sandwiches, lowering their voices, and pretending grief had a polite volume. Claire did not pretend. She stood close enough that I could smell cold rain in her hair and the faint sharpness of lilies from the arrangement she had carried all morning. Her fingers were shaking, but her voice was steady. My boss's widow cornered me after the funeral. He left you the house key. That was how she said it. Not like a request, not like an explanation. Like she had spent the whole funeral waiting for the exact second when nobody important was watching. I did not answer right away. Men like me learn early that silence is safer than surprise. My name is Daniel Hayes. I was 36 then, and I worked as a locksmith when the town needed one, and as the back warehouse manager at Whitmore Hardware when it didn't. Marietta, Ohio is the kind of town where people remember what truck you drive before they remember what you said. Mine was a dented grey Ford with a cracked taillight and enough tools in the back to make people assume I was useful but never important. Claire's husband, Robert Whitmore, had been my boss for 9 years. He was not warm. Not in the way people call men warm at funerals after ignoring them while they were alive. He did not slap backs or hand out compliments. But he noticed things. If you swept the back room without being asked, he noticed. If you stayed late to help a widow load a water heater into her nephew's truck, he noticed. If you came to work 3 days after your divorce papers arrived and said nothing about it, he noticed that too. Once, after my wife left, Robert found me sitting on a stack of plywood behind aisle 7, staring at my lunch like it had offended me. He set a bottle of root beer beside my boot and said, "A man can lose a person and still keep his hands clean." That was all. It helped more than a speech. So when Claire pressed that key into my palm, I knew Robert had not done it by mistake. Across the parking lot, Victor Whitmore watched us from under a black umbrella. Robert's younger brother wore grief like a tailored suit, clean, expensive, and meant to be seen. His eyes moved from Claire's face to my hand, and then to the key. Claire saw him looking. Her jaw tightened. "He told me to give it to you before they sealed the house," she said. "They?" "Victor, the attorney, his sons, everyone who suddenly loves paperwork." A black sedan pulled up near the curb. 2 men in suits stepped out and spoke to Victor. He pointed toward Claire, then toward the road that led to the Whitmore house. I closed my fingers around the key. "Why me?" I asked. Claire looked at the funeral home windows. I followed her gaze. Inside, people were pretending not to stare. "Because Robert said you were the only man in that building who ever locked a door for the right reason." That should have made me proud. Instead, it made me careful. There are compliments that feel like gifts, and there are compliments that feel like weight being transferred. I looked at Claire's sleeve. There was a smear of cemetery dirt near her wrist. She had probably touched the coffin when no one was looking. "What's in the house?" I asked. Her answer came too fast. "I don't know." Then softer. "But he was afraid they would find it first." The rain thickened, tapping on the funeral home awning. Victor started walking toward us, his umbrella angled forward like a weapon. Claire stepped back, as if she had already regretted involving me. "You don't have to do this," she said. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in her face. People had been telling me what I didn't have to do my whole life. I didn't have to stay late. I didn't have to check on the old furnace. I didn't have to help someone move when they couldn't pay. I didn't have to keep showing up after my home got quiet. Maybe that was true. But a man becomes what he repeatedly refuses to walk past. I put the key in my coat pocket. Claire watched the motion like it was an answer. "I'll open the door," I said. "But I won't open anything you're not ready to face." For the first time that day, her face almost broke. Not into tears, into relief. Then Victor reached us and smiled like he had just caught a servant stealing silver.
"Daniel," he said, looking at my muddy boots, "this is family business."
I looked at Claire. She did not move behind me. She moved beside me. That was when I understood Robert had not left me a key because he trusted locks. He had left it because he knew doors are easier to force open than people. And Claire Whitmore had already been forced enough. Victor's smile stayed on his face, but it went flat around the eyes. "Claire," he said, not looking at her, "you're tired, you've had a long day. Let me handle this." It was the kind of sentence men use when they want obedience to sound like kindness. Claire's hands folded in front of her black dress. I saw her thumb press against the place where her wedding ring used to sit. She had taken it off for the burial because Robert's mother had insisted the family rings should stay with the Whitmores. Claire had not argued. That was the first thing I learned about her that day. She did not waste strength where it would only feed someone else's performance. "I'm going to the house," she said. Victor gave a small laugh. "The house is being secured." "It's my house." "It was Robert's house," he said gently, and that gentleness was worse than shouting. "Until the estate is settled, no one goes in without counsel present." Then he looked at me. "Especially not employees." I did not move. Anger gives people too much drama to hide behind. Robert had taught me that without ever saying it outright, if Victor wanted me loud, I would stay quiet. Claire looked at the wet pavement between her shoes. Then she said, "Robert told me to give Daniel the key." Victor's face changed for half a second. Not much. Just enough. A man can hide shock from a room, but not from the thing he wants most. "The key to what?" he asked. Claire did not answer. I did. "The back door." Victor turned his eyes on me. "You always did know your place." I let that settle. Then I said, "Yes, sir." It was not submission. It was inventory. Some men tell you exactly who they are if you let them speak first. Claire and I drove separately to the Whitmore house because she said if Victor followed, it would look less like a conspiracy that way. Her car was a black Lincoln with funeral ribbons still tied to the side mirror. Mine smelled like sawdust, motor oil, and the peppermint gum I kept chewing since the divorce to stop myself from smoking again. The Whitmore house sat at the edge of town, behind a stone wall and 2 iron gates Robert had always hated. He once told me gates made honest people feel guilty and dishonest people feel challenged. The front drive was already blocked by Victor's sedan, so I took the gravel service lane. The back door was under a sloping porch where rainwater ran in thin silver lines from the gutter. I had repaired that lock twice, once after a winter freeze, once after Claire had locked herself out carrying groceries. She had been embarrassed that day, standing there with a torn paper bag and oranges rolling across the porch boards. Robert had opened the door before I finished picking the lock. "She doesn't need rescuing," he had said. Claire had looked at him. "I needed the door open." Robert had nodded at me. "Then open the door." That was how their marriage seemed from the outside. Not soft exactly, but built on a strange kind of respect. Like 2 people standing on opposite sides of the same storm window, each keeping the weather out in their own way. Now Claire stood behind me again, rain dotting her black coat. I took out the brass key. It slid in clean. Too clean. The lock had been oiled recently. "Robert used this door?" I asked. "Every morning," she said. "Even when the front door was closer." "Why?" He said the house told the truth from the back. I turned the key. The door opened with a low wooden sigh. Inside, the kitchen smelled like lemon cleaner and cold coffee. There was a mug beside the sink with a tea bag dried to the bottom. A chair was pulled back from the table. On the counter sat a stack of mail, held down by a brass paperweight shaped like a little door. Claire stopped when she saw it. "That wasn't there." I picked it up. Under it was an envelope. No name on the front, just one word in Robert's blocky handwriting. "Back. Claire." He knew Victor would search the office first, she said. Probably. She looked at me. Are you going to open it? No. Her brows pulled together. I gave you the key, and I opened the door. I stepped away from the counter. That envelope is yours. For a moment, she stared at me like she was waiting for the trick. Rich families, I had learned, could make suspicion look like manners. Poor families just called it experience. Claire took the envelope with both hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small storage receipt. She read the note without speaking. Her face did not change, but the hand holding the page dropped an inch. What does it say? I asked. She handed it to me. Robert had written only 3 lines. Claire knows the numbers. Daniel knows the locks. Victor knows only what greed tells him. Start where I stopped coming home late. I read it twice. Claire looked toward the hallway. The basement, she said. You sure? No, she said. But I'm tired of waiting until I'm sure. That was the second thing I learned about her. Fear did not make her weak. It made her precise. We went down the narrow basement stairs, and the house changed around us. Upstairs was polished wood, framed portraits, heavy curtains. Downstairs was cinder block, old paint cans, spare furnace filters, and the low hum of machinery keeping a rich home warm. On Robert's workbench, everything had been arranged with the discipline of a man who trusted labels more than luck. Wrenches by size, screws in jars, a small drawer marked old keys. Claire touched the label. He never threw any away. Men who own hardware stores rarely do. That almost made her smile. Almost. Inside the drawer were dozens of keys. Some bright, some rusted, some tagged in Robert's handwriting. Garage, office, lake cabin, Mum's cedar chest, back gate. At the very bottom was one key wrapped in a receipt from Whitmore Hardware. The receipt was dated 3 weeks before Robert died. I read the item line. Safety deposit box lock replacement. Claire leaned closer. Her shoulder brushed mine, then moved away quickly. Robert didn't have a safety deposit box, she said. Maybe Robert didn't. She understood before I finished. But the company did. A sound came from upstairs. Not loud. Just a floorboard settling under weight. Claire froze. I lifted one finger. We listened. Another step. Then Victor's voice, muffled through the kitchen floor. Claire, I know you're here. Her face went pale, but she did not panic. That mattered. Panic takes the wheel. Fear just tells you the road is icy. I put the wrapped key in her hand and closed her fingers around it. Back door, I whispered. She looked at the basement stairs. He'll see us. Not if he came in through the front. There was an old cellar exit behind the furnace. I knew because I had replaced the latch 2 summers earlier, after Robert complained it stuck in humidity. Rich people forget service doors exist. Working people remember every exit. I led Claire through the narrow passage. She ducked under a pipe and her sleeve caught on a nail. The fabric tore at the wrist. She stopped, looked down at it, and let out one small breath that was almost a laugh. My mother-in-law hated this coat. Then it's serving a noble purpose. This time she did smile. Not much. Enough. We stepped out behind a row of bare hydrangeas, rain needling the back of my neck. Victor was still inside, calling her name like he owned every room her grief had touched. Claire held the key tight. Where now? She asked. The bank. The bank closes in 30 minutes. Then we better look respectable fast. She glanced at my muddy boots. I don't think we have time for miracles. We drove in my truck because her Lincoln was visible from the front drive. She sat in the passenger seat with her knees together, the torn sleeve folded under her wrist, and Robert's note in her lap. At a stoplight, she said, "He trusted you." I kept my eyes on the road. "He trusted you too." "No," she said quietly. "He used to. At the end, he stopped telling me things. That may not mean what you think." She turned toward the window.
People hear silence and call it rejection, because absence is easier to blame than fear. At the bank, the manager recognized Claire and suddenly became very careful. He led us to a small side room with beige walls and a painting of a sailboat that looked like it had never touched water. The box was under Whitmore Hardware Holdings, but the access card listed two names:
Robert Whitmore and Claire Whitmore, not Victor. Claire stared at the card. The bank manager adjusted his tie.
Mrs. Whitmore, your husband updated the access instructions last month.
Last month? She asked. Yes, ma'am. She looked at me then, and I saw the wound Victor had been pressing on all day start to loosen. Robert had not stopped trusting her. He had been hiding the map from the thief, not the partner. Inside the box were three things: a flash drive, a ledger, and a photograph. The photograph showed Robert standing in the hardware store warehouse beside me. I was holding a busted lock cylinder in one hand and looking annoyed about having my picture taken. Robert had written on the back, "Daniel sees what people overlook. That is why I chose him." Claire read it twice. Then she folded the photograph carefully and put it inside her coat. Not the ledger. Not the flash drive. The photograph. I did not know what to do with that, so I looked at the painting of the sailboat. On the drive back, the rain slowed. Claire did not speak for nearly 10 minutes. Then she said, "Victor told me Robert only kept me involved in the business because I was good with appearances." I glanced at her. "Were you?" "Yes." There was no shame in it. "Good," I said. She looked surprised. "Looking like you belong is half the job, until you remember that you do." She turned that over in silence. By the next morning, Victor had filed a petition to restrict Claire's access to the company records. By lunch, half the town had heard that Robert's widow was unstable with grief. By evening, two men from the estate attorney's office arrived at the house to inventory property Claire had bought with her own paychecks. She did not cry. She made coffee. Not fancy coffee, not rich people coffee. Just a dented metal pot on the stove because the expensive machine had stopped working and neither of us knew which button was offended. I fixed a loose hinge on the pantry door while she spread the ledger across the kitchen table. Every so often she would call out a number. April shipment, missing invoice. I would answer from the floor. Victor signed that one. June repair contract, overcharged. Victor's nephew handled that. October insurance adjustment. Ask about the warehouse fire. She paused. What warehouse fire? I tightened the hinge screw. The one Robert told everyone was electrical. Claire went still. Then she wrote it down. That became the rhythm of the next 2 days. She found the numbers. I found the doors people used to hide them behind. We ate toast over the sink because sitting down felt too much like admitting we were tired. I slept 2 hours in my truck outside the house because Victor had men watching the front gate. Claire left a folded blanket on the porch without saying my name. The blanket smelled like cedar and lavender. I used it anyway. On the second night, I found her in Robert's office, sitting on the floor between two filing cabinets. Papers surrounded her like snowfall. Her hair had come loose from its pins. There was ink on the side of her hand. She looked younger like that. Not because grief had softened her. Because she had stopped performing strength for people who confused cruelty with order. "You should sleep," I said. "So should you. I'm not the widow." "No," she said, looking at the ledger. "You're just the man he trusted more than his own brother." There it was. The bitterness. Not at me, not exactly, but close enough to warm the room. I could have defended myself. I could have explained that being chosen by a dead man was not the prize people thought it was. I could have told her how lonely it felt to be trusted only with problems. Instead, I sat on the floor across from her. Maybe he trusted us with different halves. She looked up. Us? I nodded toward the ledger. You know what the numbers mean. I know where men like Victor hide when they think nobody working class can read a room. Her face changed. Not soft. Steady. She turned the ledger toward me. Then read this room. So I did. I told her about the back loading dock camera that had been disconnected the week before the warehouse fire. About the replacement lock Victor ordered but never installed. About the way Robert had started checking the alley door himself every night, even though managers usually did that. Claire listened without interrupting. Then she opened the flash drive on Robert's old laptop. There were scanned invoices, emails, photos of damaged stock, and one video file. The video showed Victor in the warehouse 3 weeks before Robert died, arguing with a man I recognized from a supply company that had been banned from Whitmore hardware for counterfeit parts. Claire pressed one hand over her mouth, not because she was shocked, because she was counting. I could see it in her eyes. The dates, the invoices, the missing shipments, the insurance claim, the petition, the house. Victor was not just stealing from the company. He was building a story where Claire looked too fragile to notice. When the video ended, she closed the laptop. He thought I was decoration. Her voice was very quiet. I said nothing. She stood, smoothed the front of her torn black coat, and picked up the ledger. Good. I frowned. Good? Claire looked at the dark window where the kitchen light reflected both of us back at ourselves. Her in funeral black, me in a work jacket with sawdust still in the seams. If he thought I was decoration, she said, then he never saw me move. That was the third thing I learned about Claire Whitmore. She did not need saving. She needed a door opened. And she already knew exactly which room she was going to walk into. The meeting happened in Robert Whitmore's own dining room. Victor wanted it that way. He said it would be more respectful to Robert's memory than a lawyer's office. What he meant was that the room belonged to his family in all the old photographs, and Claire would look smaller sitting under portraits of dead Whitmore men. The table was long enough to make every sentence feel like it had to travel through money first. Victor sat at the head. Claire sat on the side. I stood near the back door with my hands folded in front of me, because that was where men like Victor expected me to stand. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let a man underestimate the exact place you chose. The estate attorney, Mr. Bell, and opened a folder. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, given the concerns raised about your emotional state and your lack of direct ownership. Claire raised one hand. Not high. Just enough. Before you continue, she said, I'd like to correct the first lie. Victor leaned back with a patient little smile. Claire. She did not look at him. She opened Robert's ledger and placed it in the center of the table. Then the flash drive. Then the photograph of Robert and me in the warehouse. Victor's smile thinned. Claire's voice stayed calm. My husband did not exclude me from the company. He updated my access to the safety deposit box last month. He left records where Victor could not reach them. And he left Daniel the house key because Daniel knew every lock Victor forgot existed. Mr. Bell looked at the flash drive. Victor, once. That is a touching story. Claire nodded. It is. Then she opened the laptop. The video played without drama. No music, no shouting. Just Victor in the warehouse, caught under a bad fluorescent light, speaking to a supplier Robert had bound. The room went so quiet, I heard the old radiator tick under the window. Victor stopped smiling. That was taken out of context. Claire clicked the next file. Invoices appeared. Dates. Signatures. Insurance paperwork. False repair orders. A pattern does not need to raise its voice. It only needs to repeat. Robert's oldest son, who had spent the whole meeting avoiding Claire's eyes, leaned forward. Uncle Victor? Victor pointed at me. This is absurd. You're letting a warehouse man and a grieving widow fabricate. Enough. Claire did not shout. That was what made everyone listen. She stood, and for a second I saw the woman from the funeral again. Torn sleeve, tired eyes, grief pressed flat behind discipline. But she was not smaller now. The room had simply run out of ways to make her shrink. You called me fragile, she said. You called me decorative. You told everyone Robert kept me near the business because I looked right in photographs. Victor opened his mouth. She kept going. I balanced the accounts for 14 years. I caught 3 vendor errors before your brother ever saw them. I negotiated the school supply contract you bragged about at Rotary. And when Robert got sick, I was the one who noticed the missing shipments before he knew how to tell me he was scared. Her hand rested on the ledger, not shaking. Accepted, not erased, she said. That is what I was in this company, accepted by my husband, not erased by you. No one moved. Mr. Bell slowly closed his folder. Victor looked around the table, searching for the room he thought he owned. But rooms change ownership when the truth enters first. Claire turned to the attorney. I want an emergency injunction filed before noon. I want Victor removed from all operating authority pending investigation. And I want the house inventory postponed until the court reviews these documents. Mr. Bell nodded. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. Victor stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. This isn't over. Claire looked at him then, for the first time all morning. No, she said. It's finally beginning. That was the moment she won. Not because I stood behind her, not because Robert had left proof, but because when the room tried to make her ask permission to exist, Claire Whitmore answered with records, memory, and a voice that did not beg. After everyone left, the house felt larger. Claire stayed in the dining room, one hand on the back of Robert's empty chair. The rain had stopped outside. Sunlight came through the side windows in pale strips across the floor. I picked up the brass key from the table. I should give this back. She turned. Why? It's your house. Claire looked toward the kitchen, then the back hallway, then the door Robert had used every morning. It was his house, she said. Then it was a battlefield. She came closer and took the key, but she did not put it in her purse. She placed it back in my palm. Keep it until I know what it is next. That should have been the end of it. A key returned later. A thank you said politely. 2 people stepping back into their own lanes. But some arrangements stopped being arrangements quietly. Over the next few weeks, I came by to fix the locks Victor had changed without permission. Claire made coffee in the dented pot, because neither of us ever learned the expensive machine. Sometimes we worked in silence. Sometimes she read numbers from the ledger while I labelled old keys from Robert's basement drawer. One evening she found me on the back porch, tightening a loose hinge on the screen door. You don't have to keep fixing things here, she said. I did not look up. I know. The hinge squeaked once, then settled. Claire sat on the porch step beside me, close enough that her sleeve brushed my arm. She was wearing a blue sweater instead of black. There was flour on her wrist from trying to bake bread, and failing badly enough that we had eaten toast for dinner again. I thought he left you the key because he trusted you more than me, she said. I set the screwdriver down. No. She looked at me. He left me the key because he trusted you to choose what happened after the door opened. The porch light hummed above us. Her eyes filled, but the tears did not fall. That was Claire. Even grief had to earn its place. I said the thing I had been carrying since the funeral. The thing that had started as weight and turned into something warmer. I thought he left me a key to his house. He left me a way back to mine. Claire's breath caught, not loudly, just enough. Then she reached over and covered my hand with hers. No promise, no speech. Just her hand over mine, the brass key between our palms, and the back door open behind us. 6 months later, Victor pled guilty to fraud after 2 more suppliers came forward. Whitmore Hardware stayed open. Claire took Robert's old office but replaced his desk with a smaller one because, as she said, a room should fit the person working in it, not the ego that came before. She hired back 3 warehouse workers Victor had pushed out. She put my name on the repair division door, not because I asked, because she said people should know who keeps things working. A year after the funeral, Claire sold the big Whitmore house. Not because she lost, because she was done confusing a battlefield with a home. We bought a smaller place on a quiet lane near the river. It had a crooked porch, bad plumbing, and a back door that stuck every time it rained. I offered to fix it the first week, Claire said, "Not yet." So we left it. Every morning she came in through that stubborn back door with grocery bags, files, coffee, or nothing at all. And every morning it made the same wooden sigh the Whitmore house had made on the day everything changed. Some sounds do not remind you of pain. They remind you that you survived the room where it happened. The brass key hangs by our kitchen now, beside a newer one. People ask why we kept a key to a house we no longer own. Claire always smiles and lets me answer. Because sometimes a key is not about the door it opens. Sometimes it is proof that someone saw you standing outside and decided you belonged on the other side. Have you ever had someone underestimate you before they even knew what you were carrying? Tell me your story in the comments, and if this one stayed with you, like and subscribe for more stories from Quiet Lane.